Marc Dunkelman, a fellow at Brown's Watson Institute, School of International Public Affairs there at Brown, as well as the author of Why Nothing Works. Thanks for chatting.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Marc, your book opens with a scene at New York's Penn Station as a New Yorker, a scene that's very familiar to so many of us. Stalled infrastructure, broken systems. Talk to me about the origins of this book, your personal experiences, and what led you to write this.
So if you work in New York politics or are in the general vicinity of New York politics, you're aware of this book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which came out in 1974 and won the Pulitzer Prize. And it's a takedown of Robert Moses, who was like the most powerful man in the tri-state area from like the 1930s to the 1960s and built lots of the highways and housing projects and Lincoln Center and the UN headquarters, all this stuff. And he was this imperious figure who did all this stuff. And most famously, he did the Cross Bronx Expressway, where like everyone wanted him to stop, but he didn't care. Everyone wanted to take a slightly different route. He didn't listen to them. The mayor was screaming at him. Everybody was against it, but he just powered through. And like when the book comes out, like that's in the 1950s, when the book comes out in the 1970s, the Cross Bronx is sort of responsible for this notion that the Bronx, the South Bronx in particular, has turned into an urban wasteland. So I was taking the train into Penn Station at one point, rereading The Power Broker, and thinking to myself, how is it that Robert Moses was able to do the Cross Bronx Expressway with everyone screaming no, and yet nobody has turned this Penn Station, which is the world's second most heavily trafficked transit hub, and more people go through Penn Station than go through Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK combined on a given day. How is it that nobody has fixed this? And when I went back to look, like that was 10, 12 years ago, people had been talking about doing Penn Station, rebuilding Penn Station, doing something better with Penn Station for 20 years.
Right. It's something that regardless of politics, all New Yorkers would agree on, that this place is, atrocious and unworkable. And we all agree it all needs to be rebuilt.
And so the question in my mind at that time point was like, why was Robert Moses able to do things that were terrible with everyone screaming no? And he did it despite that. And here we have a project that everyone agrees should move forward and we can't get going. What had happened between the 50s and, 60 years later to change things? And that was sort of the jumping off point for an exploration. I didn't have, when I had that question, I didn't have an answer. And it developed into this broad theory about how progressivism has changed that became this book.
So take us through there briefly. How did things evolve for Democrats in particular? What you argue, they've developed a cultural aversion to power.
Yeah. So from the very beginning, progressives, people center left, I don't mean Pramila Jayapal and the far left. I mean or AOC. I mean anybody who sort of sees government as as a potential force for good. So even moderate Republicans, all the people who subscribe to that tradition have always had sort of two narratives in their head, even if they didn't recognize it. One is a narrative about tragedies of the common. We can't build a sewer system. We can't get a good school system going. We can't build parks. The power is to diffuse, to do big things. And in that narrative, which I call a Hamiltonian narrative, the notion is we should pull power up into some institution that can make these decisions for us, can build the road, the highway, the whatever it is, the hospital, that could stem climate change by being powerful enough to tell polluters you can't put any more carbon into the atmosphere.
Right. Democrats at their core believe in government having a power for good.
That is one narrative that progressives have, Democrats. Secondly, they have an idea and a narrative which will be just as familiar to people, which is that powerful institutions are themselves bad. That you tell me who has power and I will show you a villain. That power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so they saw people like Robert Moses or, big agriculture, which had sprayed DDT on the crops, or big automobile companies, which had put out cars that were unsafe at any speed, or the big defense establishment, which had gotten us involved in Vietnam, or the people that supported Jim Crow. And in all those cases, there was centralized power, and Democrats were like, whoa, we got to put guardrails around these folks. So really, for the first 80 years of the progressive tradition, Democrats were about Hamiltonianism. They were about pulling power up into powerful institutions that could do big things. The Marshall Plan, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Robert Moses, the interstate highway system, you name it. And then for the last 60 years, Democrats have been almost exactly the reverse. They have seen power in powerful institutions and said to themselves, how do we put guardrails to make sure that a person like Robert Moses or Robert McNamara, who got us into the war, or, you name the sort of powerful figure, that those people are checked so they can't do bad things to vulnerable people. And so that second impulse to push power down, I call that a Jeffersonian impulse. And my argument is, to succeed, progressivism has to have a balance of the two: the Hamiltonian impulse to empower big institutions, the Jeffersonian impulse to push power down to ordinary people, and that we've gotten sort of out of balance over the course of the last several years. And we ourselves have rendered government incompetent as a result.
Yeah, I mean, basically, these two competing notions that basically have stymied the ability to really do anything. I was struck recently, Jamie Dimon, the JP Morgan CEO, who, needs to play ball as the biggest bank in the world with both parties. He does this interview in California last week. I don't know if you caught it, Mark, where they're referring to red tape in terms of rebuilding in Southern California. And he goes, I don't want to call it red tape anymore. I want to call it blue tape.
I mean, there's definitely a point to that it's, and there are these, they call them blue state governance issues, in the notion that, if you want to do a big project, if you want to build a transmission line that brings clean energy from like a remote part of the country into a democratic city, you have to go through a governance structure and a series of approvals that makes it almost impossible to get it done. And, I think that there's some evidence to suggest that, like Texas is ahead of California on clean energy because it's easier to build transmission lines. It's easier to get approvals there. And that's sort of for Democrats, that will be sort of shocking because they think of California as being blue and progressive and wanting to be embracing clean energy and whatnot. But the truth of it is that well-intentioned efforts on the parts of Democrats to make sure that, corporate elites and, political bosses and, imperious figures like Robert Moses can't do terrible things to communities that can't fight back for themselves, have made it so that nobody can get anything done.
Yeah, diving into Robert Moses, short of people being able to read the entire Power Broker, which goes into his full history there. I mean, it's incredible when you look at his track record, right, in New York and what he was able to build, and then some of the things that he was stopped from building, right? Like he almost would have destroyed what we know is the Soho and the Village to build another highway across the city. I mean, he had really extensive plans. He was able to do some of them, not all of them. Was that the rise of that movement, the preservation movement, to stop Robert Moses? How did that become sort of a core component of the Democratic Party? The feeling that Robert Moses was bad and not good.
Yeah, but that's exactly the shift that is sort of interesting, because you see it right there in the 60s, right? You see the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which everybody remembers because there were, fights between the police and the protesters outside.
Right, this is the one in Chicago.
Park. In Chicago, exactly right. And inside you have sort of the Hamiltonian, the old Hamiltonian Roosevelt New Deal Democrats who want to empower big government. And outside you have protesters whose view is like, these institutions and these old politicians like Richard Daley are bad, right? They're the ones that got us into Vietnam. They're the ones that did urban renewal or slum clearance, which, raised whole neighborhoods in various cities. They're the ones who are behind Jim Crow and bigotry. They're old school. They're corrupt. They're incompetent. And what we need to do is push power down to ordinary people. And that's what Abby Hoffman and the Chicago 7, who are outside protesting, like that's their point of view, is that just across the board, the establishment, as it was, like then that was a thing, like the establishment. These sort of powerful, generally white, middle-aged, older men who really had power. They were the city fathers. They could choose where the highway went, where the housing project went, how the utilities worked, all that kind of stuff that they needed. Like we needed transparency on these guys. We needed some ability to focus on what they were doing wrong and to hold them to account. That was sort of the overriding message for the protesters on the outside. And the sort of notion is like that was a terrible convention for the Democrats because they end up nominating Hubert Humphrey. The country seems broken. Richard Nixon wins that campaign. And, theoretically, the Democrats come out the other side chastened. But in reality, what happens is that progressivism changes, that the core message of the protesters on the outside, the Abby Hoffmans, who are so averse to power, so suspicious and skeptical of centralized authority, they take over the sort of the zeitgeist of the Democratic Party, of the progressive movement. And for you look at the Gary Harts and the Democrats who come up in the 70s, the Watergate babies, they are not New Deal Democrats in the same way that the New Deal Democrats really wanted to build up centralized authority so the government could do big things. They are really nervous about all sorts of establishment sorts of institutions. And their view is that the world should be made more, small d democratic, that there should be more public input, that there should be more consideration of local communities, that there should be more community meetings and more, bureaucracies to oversee big decisions, and that people should have the right to sue if they don't like what the government decides to do, and there should be new procedures. You can see in that moment in like the early 70s, like in all sorts of realms of American life, there's a social zeitgeist that is averse to power. Like you'll remember like the movie Chinatown, which won the Academy Award, and it was all about a villainous guy who was stealing water from the valley outside of LA and stealing it for the city. But he's the villain of the book. Or The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like the villain is Nurse Ratched, right? Who is holding, someone who is not actually psychotic in a mental institution, right. But the villain is the authority figure.
Right, and it's probably no mistake that this comes out of the Watergate era too, where there was it was reinforced that government had too much power. Look at what Nixon was able to do, right?
And the power broker comes out within months of Nixon's resignation, right? There's a famous Super Bowl ad that comes out in 1984, sort of in this spirit of, and it's an Apple ad, and it's like there's a big face on a screen, and people are it's 1984, like
it's Orwell, right?
It's Orwellian, and people are sort of marching in step, and then this woman comes in with a slingshot and breaks the screen, sort of frees people to be themselves. Apple is taking the spirit of the messages you would have gotten in the 1968 convention of the protests against Watergate and against the war and against Jim Crow. And frankly, the spirit of Robert Caro's portrayal of Robert Moses in New York City. In all these cases, there's some centralized institution that is powerful and demeaning and imperious and coercive. And the solution, the progressive ideal is let's free people to do what they want. And like there's a reason, right? Like it's not that the complaints were wrong at the time, right? These institutions were not responsive to people. They were in many cases taking down black neighborhoods and leaving white neighborhoods intact. Like there were all sorts of problems, but by the same token, at the end of the day, if you make it so that no institution can make a decision where there are trade-offs, where is the bridge going to go? Where is the transmission line going to run? Like, where are we going to put this additional housing that we need when every community does not want new housing built in their particular place? They want more housing built generally, just not near them. Like, who is going to make these tough trade-offs? And Democrats themselves took up the cudgel of saying, we are going to make sure that these decisions are as difficult as possible to make. And now, as Penn Station became evidence of, now, even when everyone agrees that we should be doing X, Y, or Z, it's almost impossible to get there because anyone who has any little quibble with the eventual plan or doesn't like one of the trade-offs is able to stop it in its tracks.
So in essence, stopping the government from being able to abuse power, they went so far as to stop the government from having any power whatsoever.
Put very succinctly, exactly right.
You talk about this is it veto-ocracy? Vetocracy?
Vetocracy.
Vetocracy that's paralyzed our systems. How is that played out day to day? I was struck by the fact that, one of Biden's key agenda items in his last term was Build Back Better. We got to build things in this country again. How did you see sort of, this movement from the 70s into 80s and now in the, 2020s play out in the last few years?
So, let's take one example is electrical vehicle chargers, EV chargers. And EV chargers are important if you're going to get the country to buy, electrical vehicles. In some places, like it makes sense to put EV chargers so that people will buy the charge. There are other places though where like there aren't enough cars. So like nobody wants to buy the EVs because there's no EV charger. And so if you erected an EV charger, not that many people would charge it, but they're not going to buy an EV charger if they know that they're going to drive, 700 miles to grandma's and there's no charger between, where they live and where grandma lives, right? So the idea was the government should spend $5 billion building EV chargers in the places where they weren't so that people would feel comfortable buying electric vehicles. I hope that I explained that.
Yeah. Basically, one of the reluctance a lot of people have is that there's gas stations everywhere, but there's not EV chargers. And so if I'm gonna, if I need to commute between Des Moines and Tulsa with family, there's not many EV chargers in between. And so the government has to step in there to build that infrastructure to reassure the public it's okay to buy the EVs. You're not going to be stuck without a battery somewhere.
Correct. So so they put $5 billion towards this in the bipartisan infrastructure law passed 3 years before Biden left office. And when he left office, $5 billion, only 58 were online.
58 chargers.
58 chargers around the country. So that's a terrible investment. And you go back to the people who were in charge of the program and they're saying, look, we did everything we could. We were very efficient in getting a rule out and explaining states that received this funding, how they needed to work it out. And we did not put it there were not environmental regulations that stood this up in most cases. What happened was back in the day, back during the New Deal, the government would have had this money. They would have hired people directly. The federal government, Washington, would have hired companies directly to put the EV chargers in the places where Washington said the EV chargers should go. But now there is no federal workforce that can do that. There isn't even a federal workforce that can manage the contracts to hire the EV charger installers. That's all states. So the money went from the federal government to the state's government. The state governments then, by law, had to figure out where the EV chargers should go, get that approved by the federal government, which actually happened pretty expeditiously, then bid out to various EV charging companies. Here's the contract. Where do you want to put the EV charger? We'll pay you back if you do it. We'll make it work for you. But then they didn't know who was a legitimate vendor. They didn't know who was going to put up a bad EV charger, so that there were quality controls. They had no experience identifying the EV chargers. And then in New Jersey, for example, there's a pre-qualification process for getting the government grant. So these new companies had to go through the pre-qualification process. In other cases, there were local environmental issues. Then the last thing is once you get the EV charger placed in the place you want to put it, you've got to convince a utility, which does not report to the federal government, does not report to the state or local government. A utility has to wire up the EV charger in a place where there isn't a lot of electrical demand. And these utilities are already being bogged down trying to supply money for new AI, warehouses and data centers and whatnot. This is a money loser, right? So all of these steps happen. None of it is there's no bad intentions here. Nobody is trying to fleece the government. This is not government being corrupt. This is, we've set up a bunch of processes designed to protect the public, but when you put them all together, it means that government is not able to expeditiously deploy this money. I think in the end, the money, assuming that Trump doesn't cancel it all, a lot of it will get out.
Yeah, he's canceled a bunch of it, I think, so far for the charges.
I think he was only able to cancel 20% legally. We'll see whether he's illegally able to cancel some broader portion. But the general notion is this is not Biden's incompetence. This is not the people in his administration being incompetent. This is the way Democrats have shaped government to work. They didn't want there to be a big, powerful Tennessee Valley Authority, Marshall Plan sort of bureaucracy capable of doing these things across the country because they thought that whoever was running that would be imperious like Robert Moses. So they created a whole new way of governing that it turns out doesn't work expeditiously.
So there are certain places on the state level where it's been blue leadership for decades, right? The Californias, the New Yorks, some of those blue states. But at the federal level, we've gone back and forth, right? There was Carter and then Reagan and Bush and then Clinton and then Bush and then Obama. And then Congress has flipped both sides too. How is it at the federal level? What role have Republicans played in this in terms of creating the system that we're at? And how were Democrats so effectively able to kind of bring these notions to bear here, given that power is constantly fluctuating, from the right to the left?
This is a classic politics makes strange bedfellows kind of moment, Because in the same way that Democrats are really worried about powerful government institutions doing bad things, Republicans, in many cases, don't like government. So they are all too happy to create things that make government not work, because when government is broken, people look to them. And it seems like let's just privatize it, right? Like that's the mentality that many Republicans have. Like the government, their view is that government is incompetent, and then government
So
proves
in a really
itself to be.
dark way, Republicans are like, oh, we love how Democrats are ruining government and making it look like government can't do anything. That sort of reinforces our argument.
There is, the North Star for those Democrats who are today frustrated with government, and like the sort of the quintessential example is a bill signed by Richard Nixon on January 1st, 1970, called the National Environmental Policy Act, which strangely enough was championed by John Dingell, who would be a Democrat who was sort of Mr. Automobile. He was from Michigan and was not known as a great champion of environmental causes. But he signed, this is the bill that essentially says very broadly, when engineers are working on projects that have environmental implications, they need to at least talk about what the environmental implications are. So if you're going to build a highway from this place to this place, you need to think, is there some way to do this that would be less environmentally disruptive? And that law, which no one thought was going to be very particularly meaningful at the time, like it was almost sort of a fig leaf, like you figured people would consider the environmental implications and then do what they wanted to do anyway, becomes sort of the foundation for a whole structure of litigation that follows. Like people realize that if the government is required to study these things, if they haven't studied them thoroughly enough, they can go to the courts and say, I don't think that the government studied this enough. So now these environmental impact statements required by NEPA, signed by Richard Nixon in 1970, and the environmental impact statements were imagined to be 50-page documents at the time. Now, in order to get a project passed, you have to go through volumes and volumes. You have to study the noise implications, how it's going to affect air quality, and what are the shadows, and how is it going to divert traffic, and are there going to be tailpipe emissions more in this place than in this place? All this stuff has to be studied, and the burden for those who oppose the project is not to prove that the trade-offs aren't worth it. It is to prove that the studies weren't thorough. Just that, did you consider this? Did you consider that? And if the government has not considered, what the impact will be on this species of orchid that is only found in this little part of the Northwoods of Maine, then the project is dead, because
this is the vetocracy. You can veto over anything.
And there are a lot, like I'm telling you sort of one story about that. But like you can see how Richard Nixon signed it. I don't know that he understood what was going to happen, but like conservatives, to the degree that they are skeptical about government, and Democrats, to the degree that they are worried about government, so sort of their interests aligned. And so even as the parties went back and forth in Washington, everybody was nervous about a centralized bureaucrat like Robert Moses being able to do the things that he was able to do.
Given all of that, it was against the backdrop of the most recent election, and it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump is the president today. Like, somebody who talks about he himself can get these things done, and he himself, probably no coincidence that the president who signed the most executive orders in his first 100 days is now Donald Trump, number 2 FDR, in terms of their views of executive authority, their views of being able to get things done. What do you make? What's your assessment of Trump, especially this second go around, some of the promises he's making, and how we got here, given what has unfolded on the Democratic side, in particular, the inability to build anything or do anything these past few decades?
Well, I think there are two things. One is how we got here. That is to say to Democrats, like, if government doesn't work, that's a lousy political program for the party of government, right? If we're going to ask people for their votes, we need to be selling them a product that actually functions. And people want government to be making these trade-offs and be making expeditious improvements to their lives. And to the degree that we've made government incompetent, that's on us. We did that to ourselves. And that's a way out, right? But if we're not going to fix it, we're going to get more MAGAism. We're going to get more populism. We're going to get more Donald Trumps. So we are culpable in large part for Trump's victory. The second thing is, you're absolutely right that Trump has promised to cut through this stuff. His central appeal is, I'm a big, powerful guy. I'm a CEO. I will fire people who don't do the stuff that I want. I'm going to get stuff done. It's going to be fast. That's how he talks.
Right. And it's no mistake. He worked in real estate, right? He's like, I build stuff. Literally.
Yes, absolutely. Like that's his central, for as long as, like, this is a part of my book, like, for as long as he's been in the world of public affairs, like, that has been his appeal. Like, I will get stuff done that all the people who are process obsessed will not. Doge did this thing where they have fired a lot of federal bureaucrats, thinking that if you fired the bureaucrats, that would move things along expeditiously. What Doge didn't do, and what the executive branch can't do by itself, is to eliminate all these processes that Democrats and, frankly, Republicans, in many cases like Richard Nixon, established themselves, right? So, like, the bureaucracy was there to help people that had ideas for projects and to do things, help them get through all of these hoops that you have to jump through. Now, we still have the hoops, but no one to help jump through them.
He needed a deep state, is what you're saying, Mark. He needed some of the deep state. He couldn't fire the whole deep state.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a confusion here, which is that Robert Moses represented the establishment. The establishment were powerful figures in American life who could make big decisions on their own. When Democrats saw the establishment do bad things, they created a bureaucracy to stop them, right? So the federal bureaucracy grows dramatically after Nixon's presidency. Diminishes some during the Clinton years, but for the most part, whether it's contractors or employees, it grows because we're trying to create all sorts of systems to make sure that the establishment can't do the things that it wants to do on its own. And what Trump has done is he has eviscerated the bureaucracy, which is like meant to check the establishment, without actually eliminating all the things that the bureaucracy was meant to do to keep things moving. So, like, it's totally self-defeating, I think, on his part. Like, I think that the impulse is right to want to reform government. Democrats, frankly, should be for that. They like we should not be outraged when Elon Musk asks people to justify what they've done in the last week. Like that is something that everyone in the private sector is asked.
Right. That's another reaction I got from my community is like, wait, I got to do this at my job. Why are the government workers like suing over this?
Yes, absolutely. Like, we Democrats should be demanding more of government, and people who are receiving a federal paycheck, it should be our view that they need to justify their continued employment by the government. Like, what have you done for the American people lately? Like, that is a reasonable thing for people to ask. And, like, I felt like that was a setup. Like they made that scene outrageous so the Democrats would react. Is like, how can they ask? And this is disrespectful to government workers. And they're like that was a trap, and we just fell right into it. That it is appropriate for people to have to justify what they're doing. What is unfortunate, what Democrats should be focused on, is making it so that someone has the power to choose how we're going to move in any direction. Are we going to build this transmission line, or are we not? And in many cases, it's Democrats who should be wanting to build it, right? Like, if there is clean energy in one part of the country that needs to be used in some other part of the country so that we can take a fossil fuel burning, a coal plant offline, Democrats should be the ones trying to fight for that transmission line. What's often the case is we're against the coal plant, we're against those emissions, we're also against the transmission line that would bring the clean energy from the solar farm, the wind farm, the hydro plant into the city that would use it. And you can't like the power's got to come from somewhere. Like it can't be that just everyone needs to turn off their blenders. It's time for Democrats to be serious about thinking about how are we going to get things done much more expeditiously.
Yeah, I'm curious, as you've observed it, are there other lessons that Democrats can take away positively from the way Donald Trump approaches government?
Well, I think that Democrats, to the degree that they are culturally averse to power, need to be saying somebody has to make these trade-offs, right? And we have to answer, we refuse to ask that question, right? We want to build a bridge that connects one community to another, maybe a dispossessed community to an affluent one. We want to make it so that the people who live in the dispossessed community can work at the jobs in the affluent community. Where is that bridge going to go? Right? Who is going to choose, right? We know that the pedestal for the bridge is going to have to be put on one on one side of the river and one on the other.
Someone is going to lose we're going to have to buy up some property and
Correct.
change the look of at least, a couple blocks of one of the neighborhoods.
And at least. And so the question is, who gets to make that decision? Right? Should it be that legislators choose? Should it be that that the mayor chooses on each side? Should it be that some judge, using criteria that are set forth in law, that a judge chooses? You tell me who gets to choose if you're a Democrat. And like Donald Trump says, I choose, right? Like that's his MO. I'll choose, or one of my lackeys will choose, and nobody else can have an idea. Our view ought to be everyone is going to have a voice. If you live on either side of the river, if you commute, if you have a business that would be affected, if you don't want your home to be taken for this pedestal, like you should be able to have a voice and articulate to the person that is going to choose, like why you think that this is the wrong route or this is a better route. In the end, this is the figure, or this is the institution, or this is the board that is going to vote on the final proposal. And once they vote, and once everyone's view has been heard, we're not going to have endless litigation about their choice. That should be our view. It's not so draconian as the Trump, I am the dictator, I am the authoritarian, I'm whatever, I am the chooser, and nobody else can even question my authority. And it's not so that power is so diffused that anyone who objects to anything has the ability to stop the project. Somewhere in the middle there is a reasonable process whereby someone gets to choose which way forward in an expeditious manner, so we're not waiting forever.
So a lot of this is philosophical in very broad strokes. What have you heard from Democrats in terms of practical things they think they can do here? It has been interesting to watch. Yes, we're still just over 100 days in to the Trump term, but so far Democrats we're not sure who their leader is. We're not sure what their shtick is, what their agenda is. But like in terms of like brass tacks, like is there a piece of legislation that Congress has to propose? Does there need to be like some Democratic fighter who's going to say, I'm going to fight regulation, but fight it in a different way from Trump? How does your sort of indictment of what's happened and recommendation of what needs to happen, how does it actually, how do they make progress on this?
Well, I think there are a bunch of people who are talking about this, which is very different than what it's been in previous incarnations, right? After Trump won, like it was just fight, resistance. And now I think Democrats are it's not all public yet, but Democrats are talking to themselves about what does our agenda need to be like? What is that we've gotten wrong? What would draw working class voters back into our tent? Is it more of the same? Is it more strident versions of what we've tried for the last, whatever it is, 10 years with Trump? Or is there something else going on? And you're seeing bits and pieces of it. You're seeing permitting reform bills at the federal level. You're seeing housing reform bills at the state and local level. You're seeing a whole series of broader reforms and institutions being stood up quietly behind the scenes to support Democrats who are going to be more into government doing things more expeditiously. Like right now, Trump dominates the headlines. It's not quite the moment, I don't think, for Democrats to roll this stuff out. And this is not like my book does not have the chapter 10 where like here are the 6 bills Democrats need to pass in order to fix this. This is a different way of orienting your politics, right? If the politics of 1968 to 2024 was a politics of we Democrats trying to check power wherever it exists and to make sure that government doesn't abuse people. And that was our we were one note in that. This is saying, don't throw that all away. Like we do need to be thoughtful. We do need to be aware that people with power will sometimes abuse those who don't have it. But we also need to have some expeditious way of dealing with tragedies of the common. And the question for Democrats moving forward, hopefully, will be not like what is the extra check we can put in this bill, but like who is the person that should decide and what should that process be that both gives everyone a voice, but then ultimately comes to a conclusion.
Yeah, it's so ironic as we talk about here because Democrats have always been like, we're for the little guy. We're here to protect the little guy from the big guy. And the little guy got so frustrated with Democrats, they went with the billionaire real estate developer who they feel actually is better for the little guy than the party that has purported to be for the little guy for so many decades.
I mean, that is right. And too many Democrats responded that that's because they have the wool over their eyes and working class people don't understand and they're not paying attention and they watch Fox News.
Right, yeah, they were blaming the voter. They were blaming the voter for a while.
They're blaming the voter. Like, people get it. Like, our brand for now more than half a century has been, how do you stop government from doing bad things? That's been our brand. And people want government to do things now, right? Or they at least want things to get done.
Well, because in that time, we still have the infrastructure that was last built when government could do things back in the 50s and 60s.
Correct. We haven't kept up, and like, they're paying rents that are exorbitant, and they can't find, starter homes to buy, and right. If they ever go overseas, which is not that many people, but if they do go overseas, they're aware that there are fast trains in Europe and in Asia.
Oh, you look at the subway system in Mexico City or Athens, Greece, countries you would not expect have much more beautiful systems, more efficient, more on-time systems than New York City.
To my mind, working class voters do understand who we are. They've seen what we produced, and they've said, no, I don't want that anymore. And so the challenge for Democrats is to listen, not to dismiss their complaints, but to learn from them. And not to say, well, they're just racists or xenophobes or whatever.
Which, by the way, Biden did again last week on The View. Joe Biden was like, oh, Kamala lost racism.
So my view is that, like, there is a legitimate criticism of progressive policy orientation from the working class. They are fundamentally right about it, and it's our job to fix that.
One thing we haven't dived too deep, but I do want to get into a bit here in the conversation, is the private sector. That at the end of the day, a system is the way it is because someone or someone's benefit from that system. They profit from the system as it has existed. And, there are people who benefit from the lack of progress, from the lack of building, from the lack of new stuff. Who benefits? I mean, I imagine we're talking fossil fuel industry, current landowners, etc. But to what extent have businesses and corporations said, you know what, I sort of like the way things are because I am profiting off of it?
To the degree that businesses look at the market as it exists and try to figure out how to profit, I'm sure that exists. I think you're finding a lot of businesses are very frustrated now, right? There are businesses that want to be building railroads, right? There are businesses that want to be building housing. There are businesses that want municipal growth. There are businesses that can't find places for their employees to live that are affordable. So they're being forced to pay their employees more. Like, I think that what you're seeing is more and more the business community does want government to work. And that they in many cases, they'll say, I willingly pay more taxes if I understood that those taxes were going to go towards projects in an efficient way that received a service. There's sort of a notion that's existed now for decades in Washington that everyone hates taxes and raise taxes, and it's always a problem. And the thing that I feel like people don't understand is, like, working class people are making choices about how to spend their money all the time, right? Like, it's Friday night. Are they going to go take their family to Burger King? Are they going to spend a little bit more and go to, the Olive Garden, right? Right. Like, one is much more expensive than the other, better food, or higher quality food. I mean, I guess you can.
This podcast is not brought to you by Burger King, Mark.
Okay. Fair enough. So, right. But like, that's a choice everyone's making. If you were to go to Olive Garden and say you're going to spend this money and then get a Burger King meal, you'd be angry.
Yeah.
And I think in many cases, that's what businesses and taxpayers feel. It's not that they necessarily mind paying more in some cases. Like, everyone in New York State and in New Jersey and Connecticut pays more in taxes than people in Florida or Texas. But they're willing to pay, like they're on some level willing to do that because they want to be in those places. The question is, are you getting the value of your tax dollar? And I don't think the Democrats have been providing that value. And that's in many cases because in order to, build the Second Avenue subway in New York City, right, there was incredible litigation and delays and all things designed to protect people from Robert Moses.
Right. This took billions of extra dollars. It didn't end up being as long as it was supposed to be, and it took years to still build.
Correct. And it should be that if you're going to build the subway, fair enough. There are certain people that aren't going to like it. It's tough for them, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it in a way that gives taxpayers the value of their dollar. We're going to expand access to housing for businesses that need to hire employees at reasonable salaries. Like, we're going to make things work. And that involves hard trade-offs. And so, like, do certain people profit from the status quo? Absolutely. But like, the question is, who can make the decisions that make things better for everyone?
Yeah, you mentioned Second Avenue Subway. We've talked a lot about in New York, but another example that comes up a lot is the high-speed rail that still has not been built in California. And I took note of the fact that the French company that had a contract for a bit and then I think pulled out said it was easier and quicker to build a high-speed rail system in Morocco than it was in the state of California.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, that for a whole variety of reasons. Fundamentally, the issue is like, where are the train tracks going to go? Like, how much power should the town that sits between San Francisco and Los Angeles have to say, I don't want your loud, disruptive, high-speed rail line going through the center of my little shopping district, or bifurcating my town so that people, my little boy can't visit his best friend who, right now they're a bike ride away from each other. Now there's going to be a high-speed rail line that sits between their houses. Like, that's a real concern. Like, we shouldn't dismiss that as just tough, right? But the question is, if you could have make it so that people get between Los Angeles and San Francisco in a short amount of time that it takes to get from Los Angeles to the LAX to the San Francisco airport into San Francisco, right? Like, on a plane or to drive, is that better for the state of California and for all those residents? Like, you have to weigh that interest of all those Californians against the pecuniary interest of this one family or these few families in these little towns. And that's not some easy thing. It's not we make it sound like it's so easy in Morocco and so hard here, as though there aren't legitimate reasons. It's hard for a reason. Like, in too many cases back in the day, the Robert Moses figure made those choices without consulting anyone.
And permanently altered those communities.
Correct. Like, the South Bronx was turned into an urban wasteland because he didn't listen, didn't care.
Yeah.
And now we can debate now about these various projects. Like, there are certainly projects that communities canceled once they had that power that we're glad that they were canceled. We preserved communities. But now we've reached the other end of the spectrum where there are communities that are suffering now because they don't have the infrastructure that they need. It's not to say that every project should be approved or that no projects are worthy. It is to say, what is the process we are going to use to choose which one is which? Like, who's going to make those trade-offs?
And it's interesting because we are entering this era of private-public partnerships. I think NASA is an interesting example when actually, interestingly, during the Obama administration is when they made the move to allow basically private companies to take on the space program. And we've seen, between SpaceX and Blue Origin and Boeing, though they've had their struggles, sort of take things to a new level when it comes to space. In particular, when we talk about Penn Station, we have the new Moynihan Hall, which was a private-public partnership. You're not saying that effectively we need to go back to sort of an FDR era where government builds everything like it used to. There is potentially a hybrid approach of leveraging the private sector in a real way here to build some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the issue for me is not whether it's the private sector or the public sector. That almost is beside the point, because even if you're in the private sector, like you just mentioned the French high-speed rail company, they did not want to do the project in California, or said it was going to be incredibly expensive. And it doesn't matter whether it's a public bureaucracy that is going to take that on or a private company that's going to take it on. Ultimately, the government doesn't have the capacity to build a high-speed rail line. So it's going to be a private company if we're going to do it at all. The question is, how do you make the choices about which parcels of land are condemned for the tracks? Which route do we take? Who is going to pay for this? Who's going to, how are we going to compensate a person whose school is now right by a substation for the utility that feeds power into the train line, and they don't want their kids going to school near a substation, right? It's a carcinogen. Those decisions are hard decisions, and there's not a question of whether the person who is actually driving the bulldozer that that makes room for the train tracks is a private employee of a corporation or a public employee of a state agency. The question is, like, what is the process we're going to use to make these decisions? And that there may be cost savings in doing things design, build, bid. What like there are all sorts of incarnations of what the division of labor is between the public and the private sectors.
Yeah.
But no matter what you're doing, you have to figure out a process for making decisions. And that should be a public process where everyone has a voice and no one has a veto.
Yeah, because it's interesting because we've seen the counter. One of the things that we're all very closely following as we speak here, Mark, is like the air traffic control shortage and what's been going on with Newark Airport and the fact that they have infrastructure there that is like running on floppy disks and copper wiring that goes back probably to the era of Robert Moses, actually. Not that he built that, but then you have the counter, which is the new administration. The Trump administration comes in. They're like, we're going to give this whole thing to Elon Musk, and he's going to just do it, and we're going to cut out all this process because this red tape is annoying and it's taking too long, and we're overdue.
That's exactly right. There's a vast frustration that government has not updated itself, and that well-intentioned ways Democrats have created this situation because they didn't want somebody doing something abusive. And now we've got an airport that doesn't work and bridges that are falling down and seaports. And even when we put a lot of money against it, as the Biden administration did, like they invested billions and billions and billions, people aren't seeing that progress. And like, that's not an accident. It's not incompetence. It's not corruption. It's a system that was designed to fail. Things
have gotten so broken that people are like, you know what? I know that's against the rules, but it seems more efficient. And let's just let them try their process for once. So do you, having written the book, now watch what's going on, and your book comes out as there was another book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, Abundance, which covers a couple, some of these same themes. Are you an optimist in 2025, Mark, that we're closer to a solution here? Watching what you've seen unfold the past few months, the past year, are you like, well, we're doomed for this cycle to continue for a while?
Look, I find some of the Trump stuff worrying, and I don't want to minimize that. Certainly, as a Democrat, like, I find a lot of it horrifying.
Which Trump stuff related to what we're talking about here?
Well, just as you and I speak right now, like he's trying to take a bribe of a plane from Qatar, right?
Right. The Qataris want to give him a plane.
Correct. I mean, there's and who knows, it seems like there's going to be vast corruption that's going to be unearthed here. Right? Like, I find all that worrisome. I don't like some of the civil liberties stuff. Like there's a lot I don't like about the Trump administration. I will say that as I wrote the book, I was struck by, over decades, the degree to which people in one moment of American history would never have been able to anticipate what happened afterwards. That, like, at the turn of the 20th century, when it felt like nothing was getting done and like government was incompetent and couldn't get it, couldn't, what was the gang that couldn't shoot straight? Like, progressive activists were saying, like, we need more executive authority. In 1912, like, many of them supported Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican president who then ran as an independent in 1912. Like, their view was they wanted more centralized authority, and their view was that the courts were too powerful. Those people could never have imagined the era of Robert Moses, right? They could never have imagined an era where the government was so powerful that people couldn't even affect it, that there was some sort of almost star chamber of establishment figures that could make decisions. They couldn't have imagined that. During that period, where Abbie Hoffman is, marching on the outside of the Democratic National Convention against that establishment, like, there's no way that he could have imagined a period like today where there is no establishment that can make decisions, right? That things are basically completely broken. And today we're yet again in a period almost like the turn of the 20th century where people can't imagine a situation where government would be able to do things expeditiously. But I ultimately have faith that, like, we are America, and we vacillate between these two ideas. Sometimes we want more centralized authorities to be more efficient. Sometimes we are offended by centralized authority and want to deliver it back down to ordinary people. And like we sort of, it's like a pendulum that goes back and forth. My hope is that we don't go back. I certainly don't want to go back to the Robert Moses era, but we do need to come away from this, from the situation that we're in. I think this is a fundamentally American conflict, right? Right as the late colonial era, we are offended by the power of the English crown that they have over us, that we are responding to the English Parliament, that these colonial governors are telling us what to do. And so we react with a revolution and with a form of government that most Americans don't remember or haven't thought about since they were in 7th grade social studies class, called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were like basically extremely diffuse power. Like the federal government couldn't pay for anything. There was no president. There was a Congress. Like there was basically a revolt by a militia that the government had no power to put it down. Like, so we created, in response to that situation, the Constitution, which was more centralized authority so that Washington could do more, so that the federal government could do more and be competent. Then, several decades later, we didn't like that establishment, so we reacted by the Jacksonian Revolution. The establishment set up the Bank of the United States, which felt like it was controlled by Eastern bankers in New York, and so that, and then several decades after that, we had the Progressive Revolution, where we re-centralized. So we've gone from centralized power to decentralized power to centralized power to decentralized. We keep on going back and forth, and we're at the end of either spectrum. We inevitably can't imagine some other alternative. Right now, I think among reasonable Republicans and certainly among many Democrats, there's a recognition that government just hasn't been effective. And I think that we're going to see over the next several decades a slow return to competent government. It won't be overnight. It won't be totally satisfying. It will be messy. There'll be fits and starts. But ultimately, I'm optimistic because, like, America's done this before. Like, this is a quintessentially American tradition of having two minds about centralized power and trying to find the right balance.
We'll end it there. Marc, thanks for the conversation.
Thanks for having me on.